Are we recording? We are recording. All right. Yes, because the video's right here. That was Juan Internet. All right. All right, let's go ahead and find our seats. Let's go ahead and get started. So, happy day, happy Thursday. So today we are going to go over content from the College Board's Unit 4 through 5. This roughly corresponds to so the ones that we did in class, units 3, 4, and 5. Thank you, Belle. So our units 3, 4, and 5 is roughly what corresponds to this content right here. Now, this is kind of a big important part of the AP exam. This is kind of the more meat and potatoes, if you will, of AP US history. The last couple of years, the DBQ has come from this time period. Last year's DBQ came from this time period, period 4, and we've had previous ones in the other sections. But this is a really rich area of historical interpretation. Now, again, the percentages weighting on the AP. Less from the first time periods, less from the later time periods. Just like last time, for those of you who were here last time, we're going to go through by different course themes. Things like national identity, that means politics, what do we believe in politically, intellectually, etc. Then we'll go over the other stuff. All right, first, let's talk about a little bit from the idea of national identity. Again, remember, this is what we mean by what do we believe in politically. Americans value things like individual liberty, things like equality of social classes. Now, one of the big tensions of especially period 4 is this idea of a difference between Jefferson and Jacksonian democracy. Because Americans are not very, I should say, in support of nobility. We are a non-aristocratic country. However, there's a little bit of difference in what we mean by democracy in the United States. Thomas Jefferson was an elitist. Jefferson was against aristocracy, but he was a democratic sort of figure in the sense of his opposition to artificial aristocracy. What this means is Jefferson was opposed to people who were born into special privileges. So nobles, people who have their titles and land just because of their family. Jefferson was more in favor of a meritocracy, a government that promoted the talented, the smart, etc. So Jeffersonian, even though it is anti-aristocracy, it's still pretty elitist. Jefferson only thought that the rich, that the super smart, the super educated, they should be the ones in charge of our government. However, Jackson is a bit more egalitarian in this sense, not when it comes to race, definitely not when it comes to race, but when it comes to white people. Jackson is going to emphasize the common man. The common man and that participation in politics is a major aspect of Jacksonian democracy. This is where we get direct elections from the people, regardless of property ownership qualifications. So when you associate the term Jacksonian democracy, think the removal of property qualifications to vote. Jefferson thought that only property owners were capable or deserving of working in government, of voting in government. Now, kind of moving on beyond these debates between Jefferson and Jackson, we see that American national values really start to appear not just after the Revolution, but after the War of 1812. Remember, one of the biggest significances of the War of 1812 is that we thought we won it. Who remembers the big battle that was had at the end of the war? Yeah. The Battle of New Orleans. Who was the major general that led us to victory at that stupid battle? Andrew Jackson, exactly. So after the War of 1812, it begins a period of American history that is characterized by nationalism. Who remembers the other name for this post-1812 period where everyone felt good about being in the country? Yeah. The era of good feelings, exactly. I would write that down if you haven't. The era of good feelings. It's a time of political unity and nationalism. Now, this nationalism is going to stress democracy and freedom as being inherent American values. We see that there's also this observation by Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, he was that French dude, that French aristocrat that came to the United States and wrote down what he saw about American character. And what he's going to notice is that Americans have a strong sense of nationalism. Americans lack a sense of social deference. Who remembers what deference is? Yes.
Like feeling like knowing your place, I guess.
Exactly. Deference is knowing your place. Americans, they talk bad to anybody, essentially. So there is this lack of social distinctions in the United States that you might see in Europe. Excellent. The other thing, Alexis de Tocqueville says there are no systems of inequality in the United States except slavery. Exactly. All right, speaking of slavery, though, we also see that it's this time period where ideas about slavery and politics are starting to emerge. The most notable controversy is the Compromise of 1820, aka, anybody remember the other name? You're all going to be in misery if you don't remember the other name. Yeah, the Missouri Compromise, exactly. The Missouri Compromise set up the precedent of balance in the Senate between free states and slave states. That's going to be a trend for the next couple of decades leading up to the Civil War. But speaking of democracy a little bit, it's during this time period, especially in the 1840s, when we begin to see new ideas about who counts as a citizen. Do women count as citizens? The women's suffrage movement, led by ladies like Susan B. Anthony, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these individuals are going to say that American democracy should belong to women as well. So that idea of expanding suffrage, this is first wave feminism right here. But we also see that the idea of who counts as an American is expressed in debates about immigration, especially after 1820. We see that there are new immigrants coming to the United States. Who remembers the old immigrants? This will come up again, but who's the old immigrants? Yeah. The Irish and the German, Northwestern Europeans, exactly. Do these people count as American citizens? Well, some people say no, including groups like the American Know Nothing Party, for example, a nativist anti-immigration political organization. But the idea of promoting American values is kind of expressed in things like public education. In New England, with Horace Mann and the Second Great Awakening, there is this idea that public education should be used to promote American values. That's why we say the Pledge of Allegiance in the present day. That's why there's a flag over there in the corner. And technically, we're supposed to have a constitution in this room, but we don't. Sorry. We also see that there's this idea of the frontier thesis as well. American democracy formed as America expanded. And we're seeing that that's happening during this time period. We are expanding into new frontiers past the Appalachian Mountains, especially after the War of 1812. All right. Before we go ahead and look at Unit 5, any questions right now? All right. Well, Period 5 is the Civil War, its lead up, and its aftermath. We're going to see that ideas of American exceptionalism help motivate the idea of manifest destiny. We are the greatest country in the world. God gave this North American continent to its special people. It's kind of a continuity with that city on a hill idea we talked about last unit or last period. But we also see that the debates about politics and citizenship are expressed in these debates concerning statehood for the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession, remember, that's all of the land that we gained from Mexico following the war with Mexico. And that is going to lead to further compromises like the Compromise of 1850, again, trying to reach that balance over the question of slavery and representation. But we also see that the Supreme Court as well is narrowing the definition of what it means to be a citizen. In the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, who remembers generally what the ruling of that Supreme Court case was? Yes. Slaves are property. Black people were never intended to be American citizens. So a very narrow idea of citizenship. But the Civil War is going to redefine, the Civil War and Reconstruction afterwards, redefine the definition of American citizenship. During the Civil War, we start to see the flowering of language with the idea of racial equality. Things like the Emancipation Proclamation transitioned that war into being something against slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the war from being about states' rights to being about slavery. But we also see that African Americans are starting to be important in terms of direct political action. African Americans served in the military during the Civil War. 54th Massachusetts is an example of that. And the CED, the course exam description, it actually name drops the Gettysburg Address specifically. This is one of Lincoln's famous speeches that is going to clarify that the Civil War is definitely about slavery, and it's about a, quote, new birth of freedom, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I've memorized the Gettysburg Address. Anyway, get Reconstruction time. After the Civil War, we see that these debates about what to do about former slaves is going to be the central political question, especially when it comes to ideas like amendments and citizenship. In the Reconstruction period, there are new ideas of what it means to be a citizen if you're Black. The 13th Amendment, what did that do real quick? 13th Amendment, what did that do? Yes. Abolish slavery. 14th Amendment, what did that do? It extended citizenship rights to all people born in the United States. If you're born on American soil or to American parents, you are a citizen. Hopefully that lasts. 15th Amendment as well is going to extend the idea of voting to African Americans. But the thing about the 15th Amendment, though, is that while it grants universal male suffrage, it obviously denies women, the women's suffrage movement. And yet, kind of the definition of Black citizenship is undermined thanks to the failure of Reconstruction. Once Reconstruction ended, states in the South immediately tried to restrict Black citizenship. We saw that with things like poll taxes. You got to pay a tax to go vote. There are grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and in general, the Supreme Court is also undermining the 14th Amendment. The slaughterhouse cases, those were Supreme Court cases that narrowly defined the 14th Amendment to also apply to corporations, to businesses. So we see that a law designed to protect citizenship is not working. And then finally, kind of debates about labor for African Americans. It begs the question, is this continuity or is this different? Is this change? All right, that's it about national identity.
All right. Any questions about any of that before we keep going here? Yeah.
So for the 15th Amendment, like, what about the KKK and how they would stop people from voting?
So that was the whole idea there, is that, yeah, like it was a direct kind of consequence there where now that the right to vote has been expanded so significantly, this is the backlash that we see, this conservative movement where we're going to restrict this right as much as possible by making it either difficult to vote, hurdles to jump through like those poll taxes, or outright unappealing with the threat of violence and lynch mobs. But yeah, more on that a little bit later. All right. So anyhow, taking a look more at the economic side of things here, work, exchange, and technology. So we saw that early on, in the early days of the country, we touched this briefly last time with Alexander Hamilton. He was trying to modernize the economy because we saw that not having our own industrial capability during the war was an actual big liability. So we see that his policies are designed to promote the American economy as its own independent system a little bit more, including the idea of a national bank that goes kaput. And then Henry Clay shows up. So we see Henry Clay comes around with this new idea here, the American system, which is actually not a new idea. We're just going to continue Hamilton's idea here with three concepts. Everybody, three parts of the American system. Say them with me here. Here we go. First part, bank, tariffs, internal improvements. That last one was kind of convincing. Okay, so yeah, what we see is that we are going to continue this idea of strengthening the federal government with a national bank. It's going to allow for a better standardized currency because when we don't have a bank, currency is up to the states and vary all over the place. We want high tariffs, protective tariffs, because what the high tariffs do is they make foreign goods more expensive. they make people want the cheaper option, which was made in America. So protecting American businesses, we do see that that does lead to a debate over what kind of tariffs, how high do we want those? And that leads to the tariff of abomination, the highest tariff in US history under John Quincy Adams, where the Southerners don't want high tariffs. They played a stupid game of chicken trying to get these guys to back up on a high tariff. And they vote for this because the concept was just that appealing. So we have this tariff that's so high, everyone hates it, and John Quincy Adams does not get reelected. But perhaps the biggest one here is we see that now there is a bigger focus on actually developing this country's infrastructure. We see that now that we're expanding into the West and it's becoming its own unique geographic area, there's a lot that needs to be done. We have a lack of transportation. We have no roads. We have trees that need to be cleared, trails to be blazed. And if you want to get anywhere by boat, that is a pipe dream. So we see these improvements. They are mostly the job of the states. That's a big thing right there. Well, there is one federal construction project. That was that old national road kind of going through like the Cumberland Gap up there. The rest of this comes from state initiatives. But of those state initiatives, is a pretty neat stuff. We do see that there is focus on things like the Erie Canal. So we're going to dig a hole. I mean, we're going to dig a canal going right through the river over here, connecting all this area of New York into Lake Erie. And suddenly, instead of having to go all the way around from Ohio to the Mississippi, around the whole country, now you can get from here to here way quicker. So effectively, we see a huge improvement in the economy and the migration of the country. More on that later. Now, at the same time, we're seeing that the Supreme Court itself is also encouraging business here. We saw that there was, under examples like Givens v. Ogden, we are seeing that there are monopolies actually being encouraged in the development of the economy right now. The idea being that if one company can develop unrestricted, that whole industry will develop, even if it's not going to be a level playing field. So we do see that it does lead to some bigger issues, like later on, the idea of Dartmouth v. Woodward protecting the right to a contract, and therefore protecting a huge area of how business operates. So that kind of paves the way much later on for not real government control over big business, but that's not until like Unit 6, a little bit later there. So at the same time, exactly what the economy of the country looks like has been in debate for a while now. That was kind of the split between Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton wanted an industrialized economy. Jefferson wanted that agrarian one of yeoman farmers. But regardless of that, Hamilton and the American system do lead to something known as the market revolution, the biggest change in really like the culture of the society for a while. Because of this, we now always know what time it is. We have the idea of going to work versus just living on a farm and doing what you need. The idea of weekdays and seasons. Like this whole concept becomes much more of a commercial aspect as the country moves away from an agrarian society to a capitalist, market-based society. And so what we do see here is that this partly is also coincides with that first industrial revolution, which has been happening in England. Some technology coming over here, either organically because of trade or through corporate espionage, like some cool dudes just stealing materials and memorizing them and rebuilding them over here. But we see that now textile production is way more profitable. We saw that there is the cottage system, and that is going to be, remember that whole concept of people would work on something, they would then take it home to their cottage and assemble it overnight and then bring it back in the morning. Now we have, under the Lowell system, the first time where the whole production of a factory is done under one roof. So now we have these big factories, they have the whole system streamlined, and the workers themselves are going to be kept in-house. So we'll get into culture later here, but we see that the early factory workers here, we have these young unmarried women. And so they are, idea here, they're working for meager pay, they don't have a lot of rights, and it's a horrible job, but they like it because it's their own money that they're making and can spend how they want. So these mill girls, they are going to use these systems, these spinning jennies, things to spool yarn way quicker than ever before. It's going to be that way for a few decades until they're eventually replaced by a wave of immigrants who will work for even cheaper and don't have negotiating power, because there's always people willing to take their job. Now, we saw that part of the other issue of why these canals and improvements work so well is because of other technologies like the steamboat. You can go upstream now in the Mississippi River. We're seeing that these kind of mill powers, they're around. We see the steam engine. We see that all kinds of new systems are making farming and business way more profitable, and therefore they expand rapidly, especially into new areas like the West, as a whole new market gets tapped. At the same time, what ends up happening here is culturally, this has a big shift here. As the North's economy becomes more industrialized, more factory-based, their workers are not people working on plantations. They focus on these mill girls and other wage workers, whereas the South, because of the cotton gin especially, we see that now cotton is an incredibly profitable industry, effectively kind of a cash crop now. And we see that they have more and more workers who are then going to be African slaves or African American people who have been born into slavery. So effectively, the tension set up more slavery versus less. Now, moving on to the next area here, we see that in regards to the technology, period 5, the biggest thing is just that this industrial expansion is happening more and more. So we see more technology used for killing people. Some of this was designed to be a deterrent, like the Gatling gun was initially designed to be so devastating that people would not want to go to war, but it said backfires where now people can kill each other way more efficiently. So we see different types of bullets now that fire much straighter. We see ironclad ships, and we're kind of seeing the beginnings of strategies that are going to be seen in future periods like World War I. So effectively, technology in period 5 often leads to just military devastation. But we do see that because of all this shift in how the economy functions, once slavery is gone, we now have that idea of sharecropping and convict labor. And one reason why it's so heavily encouraged by these other systems like the slaughterhouse cases, because it's a very profitable system, but one based on exploitation sanity. Now, to kind of wrap up there, we do see that after the Civil War, well, during kind of, we saw that there is a huge boom in stuff being made. The factories are going to be heavily encouraged in the North. We'll see even greater production of, especially infrastructure for getting places. We saw that steamboats were a big one there, but railroads are going to become a much bigger deal during and after the Civil War as we create more and more ways to interconnect the country and eventually start using that to expand westward into the Mexican Cession and start settling that area as we saw in Unit 6 with those homesteads and the expansion of railroads. All right. Any questions on any of that? Yeah.
So for manufacturing railroads, were any of that in the South like at all?
Not really. Like we saw, like back in Unit 6, after the Civil War, there was hardly any railroads, and so they had to be really they were really behind the curve on industrializing, and so that doesn't really happen until kind of like the New Deal, basically. Yeah.
So is the American system before or after that? So can you remember
it's like during. Yeah, it's during, and we'll see that. Yeah, he was a whole thing. Don't worry, we're getting there. So yeah, basically, Henry Clay loved it. He makes enemies. All right.
Really post-war of 1812, because remember, we failed to invade Canada. We needed roads to get to that stupid part of the country, of the part of North America. And because of that failure to invade Canada, it motivates young nationalists like Henry Clay and Calhoun to be initially in support of these internal improvements. Great question. All right, geography and the environment, one of my favorite topics. So, the kind of idea of this period of Unit 4 is that slowly but surely we are migrating more westward, especially past the Appalachian Mountains. And kind of the reason for that migration primarily is because of resources. Initially, we see that kind of some exploration of the area around the Great Plains and the Mississippi River is done for fur. Fur trappers are kind of one aspect of westward migration, cute little animals being shot for their fur. We've got cropland as well. And this cropland especially is going to help explain why places like Texas places like Alabama, places like Mississippi, why these places were settled. We want more locations for cotton production. Cotton production helps explain why there is this westward migration to places like Texas as well. We also have the lure of gold and silver, gold especially in California during the so-called California Gold Rush. But speaking of the South for a second, we see that ecologically and economically, one of the biggest shifts is going to be in what cash crops are being produced in the South. Initially, back in the colonial period, it's tobacco. That is the main cash crop of the South. However, tobacco has depleted the resources, the soil nutrients of the South. And we're seeing that increasingly it is cotton that is taking over as the primary cash crop in the United States. This is kind of something that trips up students on the AP. Cotton is not a major cash crop until post 1800. Previous to that, tobacco, indigo, those sorts of cash crops. But cotton quickly replaces that as time goes on. But speaking of kind of labor a little bit in the South, it's important to understand that most Southerners didn't own slaves. Rather, it was a system that primarily benefited super rich plantation owners. And yet, despite the fact that slave owners might have been a minority in Southern society, it does still mean that South is still primarily agricultural. And we see that actually this idea of soil depletion, the upper South, that's Virginia and North Carolina, these places increasingly are overproducing things like tobacco, eventually cotton. And it kind of compels what we would call this migration or second middle passage of African Americans from the upper South to the deep South. But also kind of thinking about the environment for a second. Environmental issues also contribute to wars. We see that debates over natural barriers, natural borders, help contribute to things like the War of 1812, for example. It helped contribute to tensions with Great Britain over the Great Lakes and Oregon. It helped contribute to tensions over Spanish Florida. And of course, the disputes over territory also help explain the Mexican American War as well. Getting to Unit 5 for a second. Unit 5 from the College Board, it includes the Mexican-American War period as well. And kind of partially, we went to war with Mexico for land, for resources, gold, crop areas, etc. However, the kind of debates over the expansion of territory will lead to debates about the expansion of slavery. So as the country expands westward, as we see new locations for crop production, we see debates about slavery. But in general, we also see this issue of Western migration, California Gold Rush in 1848. There were a lot of people that came to California from the United States and from outside the United States. There's one specific group of people that came into California largely because of the gold rush. Anybody remember what that specific group of people might have been? Yes. Chinese immigrants, exactly. There's other things that happen as well. The idea of expanding markets overseas with Matthew Perry and Japan. The purchase of Alaska happens during this time. But in general, kind of the idea of expanding the country in terms of its resources and borders led to the debates about slavery, leading to the Civil War. Causes of the Civil War is kind of a rich area of debate for the College Board and for the AP exam. So understanding how expansion led to the Civil War is a really good thing to study for the AP.
So with that, we're then going to take a look. This one's kind of a short one here, looking at migration and settlement here. So again, compared to the last 3 units there was a lot more involved there, as we saw entire groups coming over across oceans and settling. This one here, really what we've been seeing in the first 3 units is kind of still going on. Mostly what we mean here is that idea of westward expansion. The country is becoming more and more filled out. There is overcrowding on the East Coast. And as we have these more further internal improvements, it is easier to move into the mainland more than ever before. So we see especially all this territory before Mexican American War, east of the Mississippi is now fair game. who's gonna slowly start to get colonized and settled. And well, that leads to further issues involving Native Americans further west. Namely, what we saw is kind of up in like the Great Lakes area, a man named Tecumseh, who we saw as part of one of the issues of the War of 1812. As we saw, he was a believer, kind of like Pontiac back in the earlier unit, about this idea of like a pan-Indian identity, to use a slightly dated phrase. The belief was that tribal distinctions no longer matter. They have to unify to push out the white man, reject the culture entirely, and get them out of our land. So we saw that there was a unified confederacy, and this kind of fear and the resulting raids on border towns in areas like modern-day Ohio, well, that led to another one of the causes of the War of 1812, as they received support from the British. So we saw that, in particular, the division between North and South was also quite significant in terms of who's moving west and for what reasons. So whereas the North, there is more agrarian farmland, we're seeing more factories eventually, but there's a lot of wheat fields being made up here. Meanwhile, down in the South, the area that used to be the southwest corner of the country, aka Georgia, we'll see that many African Americans are going to be starting to send further down into the more proper deep South, as we see it. So places like Alabama and Mississippi. And once there, we'll see that the area is prime for the growing of cotton. So the geographic advantages here help further that idea of cotton as a major cash crop, and kind of promotes that idea of king cotton. And it was just such a powerful organization and powerful moneymaker. It kind of propped up not only the US economy, but the British economy too. So we see that this also did result in a lot of hard times, as we see African Americans were often just marched there in shackles during that second middle passage. So a lot of people would sadly not survive the journey. And even once they were there, their life did not get much better due to another life of toil working on plantations. Meanwhile, way out in this new area here, once the Louisiana Purchase finalized, you can see that there's kind of a whole upper area in like this more Great Plains area and above. There is now this idea of a whole uncharted territory. We have Lewis and Clark go out there, and they are going to explore the whole area. They have their friend Sacagawea, and yes, as you learned in shocking detail last night, not shocking detail, but in a little twist there, they are gay. So anyways, we also see that there is a lot more of this infrastructure here, in particular about connecting waterways. We saw that the waterway system was kind of the bread and butter of the economy at the time, and it was a more easy way to get around instead of land roads, at least during this period 4 period. It also was a major way people explored the country and moved further inland. But at the same time, we are now seeing, due to issues in Europe in the 1840s, we are seeing that there is now a huge wave of immigrants. Those old immigrants from Germany and Ireland are now showing up in large numbers, and they are mostly settling up in the Northeast. They really couldn't get jobs down the South because they were expecting to get paid for those jobs. But once these immigrants begin to show up, then we start to see they become the dominant labor source for these factories, because many of them are poor and unskilled workers. So they have no bargaining power and they can't negotiate very well. But we do see that there is also the beginning of that idea of the Oregon Trail being able to, in a very painful way, make its way out into the West, far into the Lewis and Clark regions, and you'll probably die of dysentery or break a wagon or get shot or something. It's dangerous to move out west for now. At the same time, we see that as more people settle west, that system of applying for statehood is happening. And so more and more states are beginning to apply for statehood. And that balance in the Senate of free versus slave states becomes a bigger issue as we move further that way. And it leads to more and more tensions about slavery. The example being the Missouri Compromise, which calms things down until Dred Scott and the Compromise of 1850. Right? Now, any questions about any of that before moving on to period 5 here? Yeah.
So who owned like that northwestern area?
This area here?
Yeah.
It was unsettled, so it disputed for a while there. Nobody could even make it out there. Russia was kind of up there for a little bit. It was like British territory for a while. It's overall not important. All right. Now, moving on to period 5 there, we saw that there was bigger questions too about the full extent of manifest destiny. We saw early on there was debates about Texas and its role, but now we're going to go even further. We saw people like James Polk want to go even further. He wanted Texas, he wanted California, he wanted Oregon. We are going to expand entirely into that area, and we'll go down fighting if we have to. Yeah.
What was the slogan?
54-40 or fight, referencing the 54-40 parallel, which is like above modern day Washington. So you wanted more than what we actually got. And so what we see here is that this is going to fuel that manifest destiny belief. And well, we see that as there is more disputes, it also comes along at the same time as Texas becoming independent. So we saw that Texas is going to end up declaring independence for itself because they want to cut themselves clean from all these other influences. They are going to go bankrupt in the process. Turns out running your own country is really hard. And so we see that despite the most fierce independent people there arguing that, hey, we should move on, it is, well, rough. And they ultimately, we'll get to that later. Anyhow, we see that at the same time, there was the gold rush in California, and that's going to inspire a lot of immigrants from other places. In particular, this is the very beginning of Chinese immigration from the West Coast. And as we'll see in the next unit, that leads to discrimination of a whole different variety. And so we already covered debates about slavery. We got that already. And biggest thing is during the Civil War itself, a lot of people don't really want to come here because, yeah, there's a chance it would end very badly. So yeah, in general, migration, not quite a big deal in this unit, but next one, oh, just you wait. All right.
And then one last thing, splitting Kansas specifically had to do with those debates about Kansas becoming a free or slave state. It leads to a kind of mini civil war before the actual Civil War starts. But speaking of kind of politics a little bit, let's talk about the political parties. So remember, one of the ways to study for a push is to understand the differences in the political party systems in the United States. We're still in the first party system in the beginning of Unit 4, actually, in the beginning of period 4, I should say. In the period 1800 to 1850, kind of some of the big issues included kind of debates about the federal government's power. We have that division over strict constructionism and loose constructionism. Since those are very important terms, somebody remind me, what is the difference between loose and strict constructionism? Yes.
Constructionism is saying that you can interpret the Constitution more loosely and the government should have more freedom to do what they want, I guess, and strict is just saying only stuff that's in the Constitution.
Exactly. Democratic Republicans tended to favor that strict constructionism, whereas Federalists tended to favor loose constructionism. The Federalist Party, remember, is most strong in New England, in Massachusetts. You do need to know what counts as New England, and not just for this unit, but for other units as well. New England is Massachusetts. These are urban areas, trade-based areas. They tend to have more strong positive feelings about the British. And in the period right here, the Federalist Party was one of the biggest opponents of the War of 1812. And actually, that is kind of their undoing. Because in 1815, they meet at the Hartford Convention. Who remembers kind of some of the big ideas at the Hartford Convention? What was that political debate about? This organization of Federalists in Connecticut. Who remembers what that convention was about? Yeah, why not? Yeah, they wanted restrictions on the federal government's ability to wage war. You can put on my desk. On the ability to wage war, limit the power of president, limit the power of the South by getting rid of the 3/5 compromise, for example. And actually, that leads to the end of the Federalist Party. The War of 1812 was technically not an American victory, but it seemed like an American victory. And anybody who was opposed to that war, they were a big weenie, basically. Democratic Republicans, they were strongest in the South and the West. And some of the biggest ones in the early period right here included our guys, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. These two were examples of what we call war hawks. There's another period in American history where we talked about hawks supporting a war. What was that war? Yeah. The Vietnam War, exactly. However, even though the Democratic Republicans tended to favor that strict constructionism, Democratic Republican presidents like Thomas Jefferson didn't always follow through on being strict constructionist. Jefferson promised to decrease the power of the federal government, but he ends up increasing it. He does the Louisiana Purchase. Where in the Constitution does it say you're allowed to buy Louisiana? It doesn't. Thomas Jefferson goes against his own ideas. The Embargo Act, funding an assumption, these Hamilton ideas. Hamilton and Jefferson honestly aren't that different by the time that Jefferson's president. But post-war of 1812, we got to that so-called era of good feelings that we've talked about before. It's a time when, honestly, there wasn't any other political party than the Democratic Republicans. However, there is going to be some debates concerning regionalism. Regions of the country, the South, the West, and the North, these places fiercely debated the American system and things like the Missouri Compromise. But the event that ends the era of good feelings is the election of 1824. The election of 1824, as you might remember, that's the corrupt bargain election, where no one gets a majority in the Electoral College. It goes to the House of Representatives. And who remembers what the corrupt bargain itself was? Yes. The Secretary of State.
Yes.
Yeah. Allegedly. Yeah, who knows? Innocence of Henry Clay right here. Anyway, so Andrew Jackson won the popular vote, but because of the machinations of Henry Clay, he is going to pick John Quincy Adams as the president. Jackson hates this so much that he is going to make his own political party to run against John Quincy Adams. And speaking of Jackson, let's talk about that Jacksonian era. Andrew Jackson is the only person in American history with his own time period. Jacksonian era is going to be a time where we see this greater expansion of the right to vote. All white men, regardless of property ownership, are allowed to vote during this period of history. But Jackson's kind of a dumb person in a way. He is anti-education. He fills his cabinet with his loyal supporters. Who remembers what that system was called? Yeah, the spoil system. Excellent. He's anti-elitist. He's a populist, but he also appeals to the working class through campaigns of speeches, of rallies, of getting people drunk at those rallies and speeches. He's an everyday common dude. He's just a guy. This is where the great cheese story happens, as you might remember, the cheese story. Anyway, speaking of Andrew Jackson, Jackson is an important president because he expands the power of the presidency. The right to use the veto is in the Constitution, but Jackson uses it more than any previous president so far in American history. He vetoes the Second Bank of the United States. He vetoes the Maysville Road expansion. And he also just ignores the Supreme Court when he feels like it. Cherokee v. Georgia said that Georgia wasn't allowed to take land from the Cherokee natives. What does Jackson do? Jackson tells the state of Georgia, do what you want. You guys have the right to take Native American land. So Jackson is going to very much be this guy that expands executive authority. We also saw that in the nullification crisis. South Carolina, remember, tried to secede from the Union, and Jackson says, if you secede, I'll kill every one of you. So Andrew Jackson definitely opposed to states' rights when it conveniences him. All right. Any questions so far? Yes. There we go. Jackson's not consistent in his political views. He allows Georgia to do what they want because he thinks it helps the common man, but he also wants to keep the country together. What a guy. Terrible. Yeah. Any questions? All right, let's go to the big enchilada. Oh, no, not yet. Just kidding. So, second party system. The second party system, we've got two new political parties. Basically, it's Andrew Jackson and all of his friends, and then everybody who hates Andrew Jackson, which unfortunately is not everybody in the country. But the Democrats and the Whigs, those are the two big parties in this period right here. There are debates about the American system, about federal power, about the idea of westward expansion, but also the idea of exposition and protest. John C. Calhoun wrote the exposition and protest to protest the Tariff of Abomination. And in this act, he's basically saying, states, you can nullify or ignore a federal law if you don't like it. The Democrats include guys like Jackson, John C. Calhoun, so, terrible people, but it tends to be opposed to the American system, pro-states' rights. But the thing about the Democrats is that they tend to appeal to working class, urban, and rural voters, especially in the South and the West. Immigrants as well tend to vote for the Democratic Party because the Whigs are not the most pro-immigrant. The Whigs include John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay. They like the American system. They appeal to urban manufacturers. But the Whigs are also kind of these middle-class prudes as well. Cult of domesticity. We're going to have the strong nuclear family as opposed to these libertine Democrats. There's continuity. All right, yes. That's an interesting question. It is stronger in the Northeast, where we start to see more manufacturing businesses that include things like managerial roles. So it's not a big part of America's social class right now, but it's starting to grow. Good question. The elections you need to know, we've talked about 1824 already, corrupt bargain. 1828 is the first Democratic victory in American history. And 1840 is important because it's showing that both the Whigs and the Democrats are appealing to working class voters through speeches, through rallies, through getting people drunk. This is the so-called log cabin campaign. William Henry Harrison ran as a common man. He wasn't, but he ran as a common man. All right, and you definitely need to know Jefferson, Monroe, James Monroe, and Andrew Jackson. All right, now the big enchilada, politics and power in the Civil War period. Second party system between 44 and 54, manifest destiny. Do we expand our borders? Do we spread slavery? The Democrats include James K. Polk, the terrible man, John C. Calhoun, and the Democrats tend to be in favor of expansion and war. And yet some in the Democratic Party are skeptical about slavery, or at least the expansion of slavery. For example, a Northern Democrat, David Wilmot, he is going to write the Wilmot Proviso. Who remembers Wilmot Proviso really quickly, really quick-like? Yes. No slavery in the Mexican Cession. Exactly. Whereas Southerners want slavery to expand. The Whig Party still includes J.Q. Adams, but it also includes a young Abraham Lincoln. The Whigs tend to be anti-war, but they are also divided about slavery. Southern Whigs, Cotton Whigs, are in favor of it. Conscience Whigs are a little skeptical. The significant parties, Free Soil Party, they are kind of a party that represents this northern opposition to the spread of slavery. These tensions are seemingly reduced in the Compromise of 1850, but what ends the second party system completely is Kansas-Nebraska. The debate about Kansas being allowed to choose slavery or not slavery is going to essentially destroy any political unity in the United States. Northern Democrats join Northern Whigs to form the Republican Party. Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs, they unite to be in the Democratic Party. Now, third party system during the Civil War, the big issue is slavery. Slavery and secession, these things are the major issues at the time. This is where we get to talk about Lincoln and the Republican Party. Lincoln is an anti-slavery expansion. But the Lincolnites, the Republicans, I should say, also are in favor of the American system. Whereas the Democratic Party is kind of split, actually. Northern Democrats, guys like Stephen A. Douglas, they're in favor of popular sovereignty. Let the states choose if they're slave or not. Whereas Southern Democrats, like John C. Breckinridge, they don't want a choice at all. Slavery now and forever. And it sounds terrible, but the Confederacy you also have to know about. They did not have a centralized government, and they love slavery. Yeah. The Whigs went away because of this debate between Northern and Southern Whigs. Southern Whigs liked the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Northern Whigs did not. Good question. Any other questions? All right, one last thing, Reconstruction. The issues of Reconstruction is, how do we readmit the South back into the Union? And we see that there are divides within the political system between how we handle Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson is the worst. He wants to go easy on the South. I know that they killed 75,000 Americans, but they should just be given back into the country free of charge. Because Johnson was so terrible, Congress had to take the reins over Reconstruction. Congress was filled with radicals like Thaddeus Stevens, I should say, and Congress eventually is going to try to integrate African Americans through things like the Freedmen's Bureau and the Reconstruction Acts. These Reconstruction Acts set the tone for how Southern states are admitted back into the Union. The problem is, once these states met all these requirements, including passing the 13th Amendment, passing the 14th Amendment, we see that these states, honestly, after Reconstruction ends, they can just do whatever the hell they want. Now, there are some divisions in the Republican Party, moderates like President Grant versus radicals like Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens wanted complete racial equality for Black and white people. He was kind of radical in that regard. He wanted to take land away from property owners, give it to Black people. The Democratic Party doesn't really have a presence in the federal government during this time, but they are exclusive to the South. The South is going to remain a Democratic stronghold until 1968. The Democratic Party tended to be opposed to civil rights and in favor of white supremacy. The KKK, these sorts of groups gravitated towards the Democratic Party. In terms of elections, honestly, cross out 1844. You don't need to know that. But 1860, you do need to know. It's the election of 1860 that saw Lincoln's election, and in reaction, it saw the Southern secession movement. This is what causes the Civil War. But the thing that ends Reconstruction is the election of 1876. This is the closest election in American history, not the 2000. This is the election. Because this election was so close that Democrats felt they had a legitimate claim to victory. The problem is, Rutherford B. Hayes, makes a compromise with the South. In exchange for making me president, I will end Reconstruction. I hate Rutherford B. Hayes, but it's because of this election that ends the system of Reconstruction. Polk and Lincoln are the two most important presidents. Yes.
Wasn't there a name for the thing that Hayes did?
Yes, the Compromise of 1877.
Oh.
Yeah. Stopping federal government support for Reconstruction laws like those Reconstruction Acts. Yes. All right. Any other questions? All right. That was a lot, I know, but let's go ahead and finish up.
And this one's pretty quick. So, foreign policy, basically looking at what happens in this era. One, there's kind of two regions here. One, kind of between the end of the Revolution and the War of 1812 or into it. One of the bigger issues here is, well, there are still British presence in North America. There's even like troops stationed in posts out in the frontier area that they refused to get rid of. That was the part of the treaty. So we see that that is another source of tension. But at the same time, we also saw that Monsieur Napoleon is off fighting against the rest of Europe right now. And one way that manifests is that both Britain and France are currently picking on the little guy by impressing American ships, seizing cargo, even taking entire crews hostage. And so we see that there becomes an issue here of how can we stand up to these guys? Even in the Jefferson era, there was issues about this. We see that there was one notorious example with something called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, where we see that this is actually going to be fired upon by a British ship, and we see they're going to take over our entire crew. We're going to respond not by going to war yet, but by cutting off trade with everyone. That Embargo Act of 1807 tanks the economy. Bad idea. But we do see that that idea of impressment and standing up for our national honor is one of the causes of the War of 1812 later on. So along with that, and the idea of Tecumseh and these young war hawks. And so we saw that that idea plus Canada are reasons why we go to war later. And we ultimately have a stupid little war that ends with nothing much changing. Treaty of Ghent, that phrase there, status quo antebellum. Everything goes back to the way it was before the war even started. Now, moving on there, between what ends up happening after that, well, we see that the European presence in North America is a little different now, because we have those old immigrants, especially because a few, like the Germans, are kind of forming their own little communities and not exactly assimilating as quickly as other groups, especially due to language barriers. So we see that there is sort of a bigger plethora of different groups and cultures in the country. But what we do see is that there is a major shift in foreign policy where we see the beginning of that Monroe Doctrine, that sphere of influence now. We're basically going to protect Latin America from getting recolonized. And yeah, if they are interfered with, then we are going to fight about it, even though we really couldn't. But hey, we tried. And so this is kind of the beginning of America being seen as a protector for Latin America. At this point in time, it is seen as a good thing. But after the Mexican-American War, it is seen as just us picking on an even weaker country. So we do see that during this era, though, Native American tribes are being seen in more and more of a paternalistic light, where we simply know what's better for them because we have the boomsticks. And so we see that there is a focus on kind of controlling assimilation or even outright extermination in a few cases. We see that one of the ways Jackson was inconsistent about his own philosophies and beliefs, he definitely was famed as that Indian killer, to use a old phrase there. And we see that he's going to famously ignore Supreme Court decisions, and he's going to allow for further persecution of Native Americans. This will pave the way for that Trail of Tears, which is mostly carried out under Van Buren, but by all means following the blueprint that Jackson set. So massive loss of life, more and more of just pushing Native Americans onto land no one else wanted, like Oklahoma. Now, with that in mind, even before that, we did see that there was debates about Native Americans in regards to how their role with America is. We saw the phrase domestic dependent nation was declared in Cherokee v. Georgia, where they're encircled by a whole other country, but they have some level of autonomy. We're going to take care of them, though, in regards to that. And so, yeah, we already covered Texas, tension with Mexico. Looking at the next era there. So we kind of saw the Oregon question, 54, 40, or fight. We already covered that. At the same time, American manifest destiny is continuing. We're seeing that even as the belief of going beyond the borders of the continent is coming into mind now. We're seeing that Japanese expedition showed that, wow, Japan is really weak right now. I mean, maybe we could, get our way over there. We see ideas for expanding into Cuba, kind of paving the way for that imperialism we see in Unit 7 later on. But we do see that there's also debates about just economic gain by more and more land. We already got Mexican-American War. And yeah, we covered the idea that more land and more expansion into it leads to debates about whether slavery should or should not exist in those areas. Now, at the same time, Civil War itself, by all accounts, but technically we were fighting a foreign country in the Civil War because the Confederacy thinks they were separate. So we see that as we go to war, there is a draft, that Conscription Act. And there was a lot of resistance to that act. As we saw one of the bloodiest riots in all time, the New York City draft riots, only eclipsed by the Rodney King riots in '92, and then eventually later on. But so we see that the idea of wartime mobilization is now a new idea. It is involving a lot of sacrifices, and it's unpopular. We have the Anaconda Plan, choke out the South. War, basically, we see that initially the Confederates are doing good because they took all the good generals with them. Robert E. Lee knows what he's doing. The Northerners are Southern sympathizers or cowards. And so we see early on, eventually, we end up replacing those generals. We get better guys, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman. He burns down Georgia, and suddenly we use our massive industrial advantage to just slowly weaken the unindustrialized South. All right? Now, at the same time, we do mention that, yeah, it was also a good way to cut off support because there was initial support for the Confederacy by European countries. But once we rephrase the war to be about slavery, then that is when they don't support the South anymore. And also Seward buys Alaska, and there's gold there.
At some point, yes. All right, really quickly, American culture. American culture really formed during the era of good feelings, during a time of American nationalism. And kind of some examples of this American nationalism, especially after the War of 1812, include the greatest song ever, the Star-Spangled Banner. Oh, say, blah, blah, blah. Fourth of July celebrations start to become more of a national culture during this post-war War of 1812 era. But in terms of American art, this actually was a part of the DBQ 2 years ago, kind of American culture. Kind of some examples of American art includes the visual art of the Hudson River School. That's that very famous painting over there on the whiteboard. This celebration of nature, this American romanticism, to use that AP Euro term right there. And examples also of this American literary culture start to emerge in the 1800s. Parson Weems, he was the guy that wrote that weird story of George Washington never telling a lie with the cherry tree cutting down. So kind of idealizing American heroes like George Washington. Last of Mohicans, this was given as a piece of evidence on the AP a couple of years ago. It's one of the first American novels. That's the most important thing about it. One of the first American novels. Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, all of these are American literary contributions. But in terms of philosophy, the post-1812 period sees the rise of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism stresses harmony with nature and civil disobedience. Those are the two biggest aspects of transcendentalism. Harmony with nature, civil disobedience. And we see that with guys like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson left, or no, that's a different guy, never mind. However, in terms of religion, the biggest kind of aspect of this period is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is all about emotion, individuality in religion. The First Great Awakening, it was very much a kind of fire and brimstone. You are going to hell. However, in the Second Great Awakening, it was much more, you guys have a chance to be saved. It's more positive, uplifting. And as such, it kind of has this idea of we need to change society for the better. More on that later. Some important guys from the Second Great Awakening, Charles G. Finney, and of course, the boy Joseph Smith himself. What religion did Mr. Joseph Smith found? Yes. Mormons. Mormons come up in the 1840s, earlier actually, but in the 1840s especially. African Americans also participated in the Second Great Awakening, Richard Allen and the AME. That's an example. It starts in the Northeast in the burned over district, but it is going to spread out west thanks to these proselytizing, aka evangelical ministers. And the reform movements, we'll talk about those later. But in terms of kind of differences, the South tended to embrace a different type of religion, baptism. Baptists in this time period tend to be more hierarchical. Slavery is kind of cool and granted by God. Don't take that out of context. So the idea of slavery being natural in society, guys like John C. Calhoun saying slavery is a positive good. However, we do see that there are some exceptions, some historical complexity, if you will. The Grimke sisters, these were Southern abolitionists who were pretty cool. The South loved slavery. And the old immigrants as well, that kind of expresses new voices in the United States. We're not just a bunch of Anglos, but we have the Germans and the Irish. How exotic. Now, last thing about regional identity is that the Civil War kind of breaks down national identity. Obviously, if we're fighting each other, we're not a unified national culture. And we start to see that even before the Civil War, there is growing regionalism in the United States. The North might not have been anti-racist, but it was against slavery. Things like Uncle Tom's Cabin promoted opposition to slavery on a cultural basis. The North as well just had a different economy and different set of immigrants, making it a separate part of the country. Whereas the South just loves slavery. The South, awful. That's a continuity in American history. The South is terrible. They love slavery. And they also are feared of Northern abolitionism. This idea of states' rights is a major part of Southern regional identity. But last thing, after the Civil War, America sees a new, refound sense of nationalism. The Civil War produced heroes like Lincoln, like Grant. These guys are gods in the American experience. The exception, though, is the South. The South is going to also promote this idea of the lost cause. Maybe the Civil War wasn't about slavery, and maybe it was pretty cool. All right, terrible.
All right, one last one, folks. So basically, we look at like kind of how the social structures of this era are going, and we kind of covered a lot about this first part right here. We're seeing that due to that market revolution now, we're seeing that people who make money are at the top, and people who own these factories are slowly becoming at the top. So we see that now that more and more of the country is connected to a market economy, the idea of making a wage for a living is much more dependent on if you have a happy life or a not so happy one. So we see that factory owners are at the very top. Factory workers are just a cog in the machine to be exploited. But we do see that among the things that that leads to is, well, we see that there are more poor people in a market economy, and therefore their needs aren't getting met. People drink to cope. That's going to lead to some of those reform movements later. But we also do see that because of those mill girls, women are getting jobs. And so that leads to different eras. Some people see this as a source of liberation or a chance of independence. Others see this in another way. As the middle class begins to rise, we see now this idea of the cult of domesticity, where middle class women are just deserved to be housewives and mothers. It is their God-given duty, and they don't need an education for that. So Republican motherhood, it's kind of back, but it's even dumber now. At the same time, we see that Jacksonian democracy, common man, property requirements gone. We covered that. Second Great Awakening, though. We see that now there's this belief about reform movements in time as we see more and more focus on this idea of making the world itself better. So we saw that there was a lot of different eras here of different reform movements working with each other. For example, women were given a much higher role in regards to maintaining the moral superiority of the household. We saw that it was based on this idea here of reform is the Christian thing to do. And you'll see some examples in a second here of faith and good works. That's how we make sure everyone gets into heaven, because everyone can get into heaven. We saw that there are some examples, Sojourner Truth being one, of women and abolition working together. A lot of people were involved in more than one movement. And so we also saw that this movement here focused on the idea of equality between all people. That is the Christian thing to ensure that there is no division. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ. And so with that, we see movements like William Lloyd Garrison writing very fiery, like the "I will be heard" thing in his news article, The American Colonization Society. We are seeing that all of these different groups begin to start campaigning for a different kind of equality here, where they're going to start looking at not necessarily legal oppression, but either maybe allowing for African Americans to just kind of go back to Africa as we saw it. So again, the North is not exactly a beacon of hope. They are also racist, just in a different way. So we saw that among some other things, we see the beginning now of the idea that if you're drinking, it's a sin and it's causing all kinds of sin. So we need to get people to stop drinking, and that's how we cure the woes. American Temperance Society, Lyman Beecher, what a guy. Now, of other movements that we saw, we kind of covered education already, but we saw mental health is now being seen as kind of care for people with mental disorders, being allowed to getting these kind of institutions. We are seeing that Seneca Falls is going to have a major focus here because these women were abolitionists and they get kicked out of a meeting for their gender. So we see that now there's a focus on this first wave of feminism here. Women should be given the chance to vote and decide for themselves their own fate. And it takes a long time. We do see, though, thanks to this new wave of immigrants, especially poor, unskilled worker immigrants, there's now the beginning of this wave of immigrants are the problem, that they are a drain on society. And so the way that manifests early on is hostility, especially towards Irish people. So no Irish need apply. And that kind of fueled the idea of stereotypes. Irish people are drinking and getting and having all of that. So we need to fix this problem and bring up a better civilized society. at the same time, we see this is really the beginning of this idea of anti-slavery movements. And again, there's lots of different ways. There are some versions of talking it out, of trying to appeal to people's moral persuasion. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, giving speeches. Some of them, there is outright rebellions. Nat Turner and all of his rebels are going to end up getting killed for what they believe in. But most people are going to do this passive style of just working slowly, breaking tools, pretending to get sick, bee stings, stuff like that, that just make the economy itself go down, because really that's what these masters care about. Now, lastly, Unit 5 here, we see that there is this bigger cultural divide over slavery. As we mentioned, the North, their biggest thing right now is that they don't really care about African Americans either, but they think slavery is wrong. So there was the idea, send them back to Africa, American Colonization Society. We saw the Wilmot Proviso. We want no slavery in the Mexican Succession, but we want no African Americans there either. We want the area for white people. So we do see it's a minority and not very popular, but abolition is becoming a thing now. We do have a few people out there ahead of the curve that think that maybe African Americans deserve to walk free and integrate in society. Now, this idea will slowly begin to be more acceptable to the mainstream, thanks to books like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, allowing for a more detailed narrative of what slaves go through, depicting them as human beings and Christians, and therefore deserving of sympathy. So we see the North, thanks to Uncle Tom's Cabin, begins to be much more open to the idea of abolition. Meanwhile, the South, thanks to assholes like Calhoun, they see it as now slavery is overall a good thing because now slaves have the right, have the ability to speak English and know who Jesus is. So we're helping them. Meanwhile, we mentioned earlier the idea here, the Emancipation Proclamation changes the goal of the war to be about slavery, encourages slaves to get involved. We saw that was a pretty cool thing. Now, at the same time, we kind of mentioned it earlier that, yeah, Reconstruction is ending slavery on a legal level, but racism is still apparent in all of these hurdles to Reconstruction, notably groups like the KKK or the Mississippi Plan to restore white dominance in the South by any means necessary. So we saw that all those legal hurdles like sharecropping, and it's all going to culminate in segregation being upheld in Plessy v. Ferguson, which will be the law of the land for 60 more years until Unit 9 civil rights movements. All right. Any questions about any of that?
Boom. All right, that was it. Like we said, we'd go a little shorter, and we were. Yes. All right. Thank you, guys. Have a blessed day.